Okay, chapter one. So, what I'm looking for here is you understanding the difference between experiments, surveys, and basic qualitative research. So, what I'm going to be looking for is just, you know, what these different types are looking for, right? Like that experiments are looking for how you observe changes in people's behavior based on introducing changes to their environments, right? Um, when with surveys, you're looking at what people say they do, right? Because you're not actually observing them. You're looking at what they're saying, right? They're self-reported. And then qualitative research in general is the kind of research that's going to involve often field research or in-depth interviews, right? That's all you need to know for those. Just being able to tell the difference between those three, pretty straightforward. All right, chapter two. Um, Verifying data. Just the idea that how is it that you verify? You verify by observing things, right? That's pretty straightforward. Let's see. Deductive reasoning. Just that deductive reasoning is that if the evidence is true, then the conclusion must be true, right? And the chapter goes a lot into this kind of understanding of the difference between deductive reasoning and inductive logic. So for inductive logic, this is the process where you go from where you collect data first, then in the data you look for patterns, and then when you find those patterns, you apply theory to it, right? Versus deductive reasoning, you're starting with theory and you're saying if this theory is true and the evidence to support it is true, then the conclusion of the theory must be true, right? So it's a little bit different in its approach. With inductive, you're collecting the data first, looking for patterns, and then responding to what you find in those patterns with theory. Versus deductive, you have the theory, then you're testing it. Okay, let's see. So yeah, that's basically all I'm looking for for deductive versus inductive. It's just the which one is testing a hypothesis versus which one is much more reasoning patterns from data, right? Okay. Let's see. Goal of science, to develop theory. Straightforward enough. And the Hawthorne effect, just that's where people often change their behaviors when they know they're being studied. So far, you're doing great. You're getting an A on this exam, right? It's easy peasy. Okay, chapter 3. Let's see, the issue of potential harm. So even though researchers want to protect their participants from potential harm, it still may occur in spite of a researcher's best intentions. Obviously, you should limit any potential harm that could come to your participants. But the idea is that oftentimes we can't necessarily predict all of the likelihoods of what research could do. So even though a researcher is trying hard to protect against that, it may still occur. Zimbardo's prison experiment. Remember, there was the videos that I put in chapter 3 lecture. So if you didn't listen to it, this is the time. Zimbardo's prison experiment was basically the situation where he was trying to put that theory of a definition of a situation to the test. So he put these students, Stanford students, he split them down the middle. Half were guards, half were prisoners, and basically testing how the social roles themselves created the kind of behavior and difference. So, yeah, basically all you need to know about it is that it was ended early because it harmed participants so much that they started having psychological breakdowns, which, again, if you didn't watch the video, maybe you should watch it. But anyway, so they started having psychological breakdowns, and they had to stop the research as a result. All right, Milgram's obedience experiment, another video in there. So in Milgram's experiment, he was trying to measure obedience, meaning he was trying to see whether or not people would go against their own conscience to do what an authority figure tells them to do, right? And in this case, the authority figure was just a person in a lab coat. You didn't really know what their qualifications were. So the reason that it's considered such an ethical problem. So basically what happens is they have two pairs. It's supposed to be one person's a learner, one person's a teacher, but the learner is just part of the experiment. It's a recorded set of responses, right? So the teachers sat in front of this electric generating board, and they know that they're supposed to test the person in the next room on a word pair association test. And if they get it wrong, they're supposed to give them an electric shock. So this is kind of that classic how experiments work, where sometimes you're using deception in order to, basically they think they're testing someone on word pairs, but in reality they're being tested on if they would be obedient to an authority figure. So the reason that this was so ethically a problem is because he didn't get informed consent. So people didn't understand that that they were in this study, that they could be potentially harmed, and a lot of people showed emotional and psychological responses to the research. And again, if you watch the video, you'll know what I'm talking about. All right, debriefing. Basically, debriefing is one of those things where you talk to people after the research happens so that you can kind of explain to them what your aims were, and then always ask them or give them the opportunity to voice any concerns or perceptions or issues that they had with the research. So debriefing is one of those things that you obviously, if you're using deception like Milgram was doing, then you obviously have to do it. But in reality, debriefing should really occur in all studies with human participants, not just those that have deception. Of course, the ones with deception, you definitely have to. But those any research studies with participants, you should have some sort of debriefing, really just so that they understand what the research was about, and so they get to voice any concerns that they have. All right, confidentiality. Confidentiality, all you really need to know about that, there's a difference between anonymity and confidentiality. So in some research, you can let people be anonymous, right? But if you're doing like an interview, you can give people confidentiality but not anonymity, because it'd be totally weird if you didn't know who the person was that you're sitting across from, right? Like they're not anonymous to you as the researcher, but they can be confidential in the way that you basically just ensure that you're protecting their privacy by just changing their name or protecting their identity in that way, right? So that they can talk about sensitive topics or issues without fear of, the information they're talking about coming back to harm them in some sort of way. All right, so ethical issues. For that one, I'm actually going to ask kind of a hypothetical in your test. Just that really, like, what are the issues, like the problematic issues with ethics? A big one when it comes to informed consent, it's really okay. So basically the question's about informed consent. Being able to assure a person that what potential harm they might face, all of those kind of things, but also that their participation is voluntary. And so if you have a situation like, let's say you go into a prison and prisoners are ordered to participate, or a school or something like that where you don't, there's a power dynamic where someone has to participate, that's unethical. Because with any social research for human participants, they should have the choice in whether or not they're participating. All right, politics and research topic selection. Just that you can't avoid the influence of your political ideology on your topic selection. Meaning, like, you pick what research topic you do because of your own experiences and ideologies, and that's not something you could just magically put aside when you do your research. So really the key to these things is understanding who you are and having reflexivity, so that you understand what potential bias you might have so that you can counter that in the actual research. And of course, if you use rigorous methodological approach, it doesn't really matter what your opinion is, because the research itself, the methodology, is going to guard against your potential bias. So when it comes to politics, like, that's always going to influence what topics you're interested in. So that's going to affect what you research, because obviously it's much better to research stuff you're interested in. All right, chapter 4. Let's see. So this one, I'm just trying to test the difference between what a quantitative research question is versus a qualitative research question. Meaning, what you just, to understand these two, all you have to understand is what a quantitative question is trying to ask versus what a qualitative question is trying to ask, right? So if you're looking at something like what particular actions or patterns or things people do, that's quantitative, right? So what are like these particular habits that this particular group of people have? That's going to be a quantitative kind of question. A qualitative question is typically more of like how, not what. Like what questions are more quantitative. Qualitative is more like, how do a group of people understand a particular thing, right? So how do they think? How do they feel? Those kind of questions are qualitative. So really it's like the scope of the question. Is it a big, large scale thing that's looking for patterns that are larger scale, or is it something that's smaller scale looking at meanings and beliefs of a small group, right? That's how you know the difference. Unit of analysis, I'm going to give you a little one there too. A little tricky. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that tricky. To identify what a unit of analysis is, right? So it's the thing that you're studying. So I'm going to give you like a little hypothetical that is basically you're going to have to figure out which thing is the unit of analysis. Hint, it's the thing being studied. So if someone's analyzing, if they say like, in this research, so-and-so analyzed blank, hint, that's their unit of analysis. Anyway, all right, identifying variables, similar kind of thing. I want to give you like a somewhat of a hypothetical for this as well, just because with variables, what you want to encounter are categories that encapsulate different things, right? So let's say you were trying to look at, voting patterns or something. You would look at, a variable would be political party affiliation. A variable wouldn't be Democrat, because Democrat is one part of political party affiliation, right? It's not as if that's the only option for political party affiliation. So a variable is something that has those kind of different dimensions of it typically, right? So if you're talking about, someone's religious affiliation, right? That would be a variable. But saying someone is Protestant is not a variable. That's one measure of a variable, if that makes sense. So that's really what I want you to be able to identify there, is a variable, something that you can actually study and has like multiplicities depending on who the person is. So like age is a variable, right? But being a specific age is not a variable, because that's just one possible answer for the variable age, if that makes sense. So that's really what I'm hoping that you find there. So something like occupation is a variable, but saying like professor, that's a potential occupation, but that's not like the only occupation, right? So in that way, that's what I'm looking for the variable stuff. Okay, and then really just being able to identify independent variables, dependent variables, and control variables. So taking it a little bit farther. So basically, the independent variable is always the one that you assume is causing change in the dependent variable. So that's really all you're going to have to identify to find the independent variable in the question I'm giving you, is which one is causing change in the other. And then dependent, same kind of deal, except for in this one, you're going to be looking for what is being affected by something else. And the control variable is something, I know it's going to sound obvious, you control for, right? So let's say you're comparing students and you control for gender, right? Then gender is going to be your control variable. Let's say you're looking at social class and you control for race. Then race is going to be your control variable, right? It's kind of that obvious. And again, the dependent is the one that's being affected or changed by the independent variable. Okay, let's see. So, chapter 5. Conceptualization. This is just again, the step in the measurement process where you're trying to define what your concepts are going to be, right? So this is where you're kind of it's a more theoretical approach that you do at the kind of beginning of that. That's all you're going to be testing on there. Let's see, creating an operational definition of a concept. So that's like the next step where, you want to consider the theories that are related to the concept, right? And you want to select a definition that's going to capture the meaning of your concept, right? So that, let's say you want to say, what are people's opinions about a particular variable? You then have to turn that variable into a question, right? Into something that can be measured. So that's the operational definition of a concept, right? So, yeah, all you need to know is that it just usually you're going to need more than one indicator to measure a complex concept, and that you need to understand the theories and you make the definition based on that. Let's see, level of measurement is just the kinds of comparisons that you make between cases in different variable categories. So that's really all. Levels of measurement. You have the nominal, ordinal, ratio, interval, all that kind of fun stuff. So knowing the differences a little bit, like there's going to be a question on each one. So each one, though, the way that I'm doing these is to give you, again, a kind of scenario. So remember, nominal is something that has no numerical equivalency or value. So something that you make up, there's no, ordinal has like that rank ordered levels, right? So if you were saying social class of like the upper class, middle class, lower class, right? It's not necessarily numerical the same way, but it can be made so because it's stratified in that ordinal way. A nominal is like, they're just words. So like political party affiliation would be a good nominal one because there's no like numerical or rank order difference between being a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or a libertarian or Green Party or peace and freedom or whatever it is, right? Let's see. But ordinal, again, it has that rank ordered thing. So, if you were to say something, like let's say, you're measuring frequency of, studying or a frequency of attending class, right? You'd have people that attend class all the time. Then you'd have people that have missed a couple classes, people that have missed a bunch of classes, just kind of like in a rank ordered way. So that's how you're going to determine the ordinal one. And then the ratio is when you're basically trying to measure something that you can actually measure from like a absolute or true 0 point. Actually, again, that's actually the other part of the question, which is what makes the ratio different. Interval ratio is kind of the same, except for ratio can be a true 0, meaning that whatever that variable is has an actual 0 point, which is kind of what distinguishes it. So again, a ratio would be something numerical that you could measure, like what is the average amount of time you spend on housework per day or something like that. That would be a ratio level of measurement as an example. Okay, let's see. So that's that. Chapter 6. Okay, probability sampling. Basically, that the whole, like, what I'm asking you for this one is, why do it? What is it? What's the point of probability sampling? So really, it's just to find objective research that you can estimate to a population's characteristics. That's what I'm looking for there. So the whole point of probability sampling is you have something that represents the overall population. So if your sample is representative of the overall population, then your results of your research can be generalized to the overall population, hence the point. Okay, calculating margin of error in a sample estimate. So basically, to do this, there's a couple things you need, and that's what the question's about. So, again, this is like a mathematical equation they talk about in the chapter. You need to know the size of the sample and the standard error of the sampling distribution in order to calculate the margin of error, but you're also going to you will calculate the margin of error to a desired level of confidence. So 95%, 99%. So that's basically what you need in order to calculate it. The size of the sample, the standard error of the sampling distribution, and your confidence level. Alrighty, defining a population, a survey. So basically there's a two-step process when it comes to defining a population in a survey. So first, you have to figure out who is it you want to study. Who's your target population? So if your target population was like students, right, then you would have to say, okay, now the second step, if I figured out, okay, students is my target population, then who's going to be my sampling frame? Like who then you make a sampling frame to say who's going to be the sample I choose that represents that overall population. So that's really, when you look at defining a population in a survey, first, like, who the hell are you trying to study, right? Who's your target pop? And then from that, how are you going to develop a way to sample that will reflect that target population? All right, and reasons for using stratified sampling. There's two main reasons they talk about in the chapter. Often it's to increase the number of cases in a particular subgroup. Like, let's say you want something to more accurately reflect the population, or you have a group that's kind of like underrepresented. So you would take multiple stratified samples instead of like one big sample in order to kind of balance that stuff out. And then the other one is because the more respondents you have, the more that decreases the margin of error. So the idea is by using stratified sampling, you can pull in more respondents through smaller subgroups, and that's going to decrease the margin of error, which is a good thing because you kind of want to have less error. You want to make sure that your results are more reflective of what you're finding. Let's see. Okay, so that's that. Chapter 7. Manipulation of the independent variable. So just the idea that in research, right, there's often this situation where you manipulate an independent variable, but the strength of that is that you basically change the independent variable to see then what effect it has on the dependent variable. And this has like a time order to it, right? So it basically shows, okay, this existed, like this dependent variable was just happening. And then when we changed the independent, it had an effect on the dependent. So there's like a time order of this, like one thing occurs before the other, right? The egg before the chicken, right? Okay, let's see. Next one. Test of statistical significance, just like, why are we doing it? That's what the question is about, right? What is the causal criteria for doing this? Well, you want to have some sort of association. That's really what you're looking for. Okay, so purpose of tests of statistical significance. So the whole point is you want to see if there's some sort of reasonable explanation for what's going on. And that's why you're using statistics instead of just an observable situation. So you want to see if there's some chance, there's some explanation of the experimental results. Okay, so some of the advantages of survey-based experiments. Being able to use large and diverse samples of research participants is definitely an advantage versus some other methods. And largely this is because, if you're doing like interviews or things like that, you can't really reach that many people because of the practicality of how long it takes. So that can be definitely an advantage to using survey-based experiments, is that you're actually reaching a lot more people than you could in an experimental lab survey, or in a lab context, in an experimental lab. And really it's helpful for you to still get an impact of how these variables are, forming a relationship with this person's, with their opinion or insight into, how it affects their understandings or behaviors. Pre-testing, the whole point of it is to make sure that it's actually going to function in the way that the researcher thinks it is, and kind of find a lot of those like snags and problems before you go through the actual work of doing the research. So as a result, pre-testing in the book, they talk about it as a analogy to performing a play, that if you're performing a play, then pre-testing is rehearsing it, right? That you want to see whether or not it's going to go right. So just like with a play, you would rehearse it to make sure that everyone's lines are right, or that the cues are there, or that people are aware of any of the kind of snags that could happen, so that you don't test it the first time in front of people, right? All right, chapter 8. Let's see. Features of survey research. Just that survey research typically has large samples, right? They're probability samples, where they're picking them as randomly as possible. They're typically structured questionnaires, or sometimes actual interviews, but using a survey tool. And of course, a huge feature of survey research is quantitative analysis, being able to statistically interpret the findings of the research surveys themselves. Let's see, open-ended questions. Actually, it's, if you want to reference this, that's part of that box 8.1 in the chapter. But just knowing that open-ended questions are something that often come up in semi-structured interviews, as semi-structured interviews have certain questions they're asking, but they also want to give the opportunity to probe deeper, or to ask follow-up questions that might be related to something, that a tangent or something someone said. So there's that. Let's see, difference between laboratory experiment, cross-sectional survey, and longitudinal survey. So another fun hypothetical, yay! So think about what the elements of these things are differently, right? A lab experiment, a strong feature of that is that it's going to take place within a lab setting, typically, right? So that helps you figure it out immediately. Cross-sectional surveys are just research that was done at one period in time, like a snapshot once. And what is easy to tell the difference between that and longitudinal is over time, multiple surveys. So that could be either the same group is being surveyed multiple times, or the same survey is being administered to different people, like the GSS or something, but over long periods of time. So cross-sectional is just going to be a one-time research thing that's happening in the actual world, right? Versus the lab experiments happening in a lab. And longitudinal is the survey, but over a period of time. All right, and then trend studies versus panel studies. This is just the difference between those kinds of longitudinal, right? So if you're asking the same questions, but to different people, that's a trend study, right? So that's, if you ask on the GSS every year, do you approve of same-sex marriage or something like that? That's a trend study. So it's a longitudinal in the fact that it's asking the same question over time, but it's not asking the same people. If you're asking the same people, that's a panel study. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough. Let's see. Face-to-face versus telephone. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so just the idea that compared to face-to-face interviews, telephone interviews they need to be easier to ask, because you don't have the opportunity to probe as much. You don't often have as much time for those telephone interviews. Like, people want to get off the phone. So you have to make kind of like a quicker, easier version of your questions. Let's see. And then face-to-face actually produces a lot less error, especially in terms of coverage and non-response, because people are going to answer the question because you're looking them in the face. That's pretty much how that works. Comparing survey modes. Just, how you want to think about how different modes have different benefits, or, just actually kind of like the one I was like giving an example of. So there's benefits to telephone interviews, there's benefits to mailed questionnaires, there's benefits to internet surveys, but typically face-to-face interviews are the ones that have the least problems, again, because people respond, and it's easier to, kind of probe them for answers when you're staring at their face. Versus it's easier for people to just kind of like hang up on the phone or not mail back a questionnaire or, not finish an internet survey, right? People feel more engaged or responsible to do so if there's a person's face in front of them. Let's see, chapter 9. Okay, so ethnography. What distinguishes it from other kinds of field research? That's all I'm looking for there. So, what tends to distinguish it, I mean, all field research is looking at observations of people, typically in a group setting, and they're trying to understand like how people live and all that stuff. But so they're observing people in their natural locations. That's all field research. But what's different about ethnography is that it focuses on the culture of a particular group of people, on their habits, on their meanings, on their language, on all of that stuff. So it's typically focusing on a culture of people, sometimes subcultures. Reflexivity. This is just one of those things where with reflexivity, you really think deeply about like, who am I? What biases do I have? Who do I come across as to my participants of the research? So meaning, how is your presence affecting the research? Are you biasing it in any particular way? Are you affecting it in your personal characteristics, right? Meaning like personally being female. Like, does my gender affect this? Does my race affect this? Does my social class? Does, my level of education? Does any of these kind of personal characteristics? Because that can affect who actually wants to be in your research, right? Like I have a mentor that he was doing research on gangs on the East Coast, and he's Dominican. So he appears, to the layman African American, yet he also speaks Spanish. So when he came to the West Coast and tried to do research out here on gangs, they had no idea how to understand that because it's kind of one or the other in the gang cultures here. So his personal characteristics of being both black and, Dominican, being able to speak Spanish, meant that those people didn't really understand how to interact with him in the same way. So his personal characteristics of the researcher affected whether or not people wanted to be in the research. So reflexivity is how you find that stuff by reflecting. Okay, sampling methods in qual. Just that when you're looking at sampling in qual, you're typically going to be looking at snowball, which is where you interview people or you have contacts and then you ask them, hey, do you know anyone else that would fit the context of this? And then they say, yeah, I have a friend. They might be interested, and they give you their contact. That's snowball sampling. Or purposive sampling, where again, you're finding a kind of convenient sample in relation to the population you're studying. You either get contacts through other people or through networks of affiliation, all of these things. So basically, purposive, snowball, those are the ones you're typically going to use for qualitative. And really all you have to know for the question is that you're not using probability sampling. You're using non-probability sampling. It wouldn't make sense to use probability sampling because probability sampling is like any random person. Let's say you're trying to study like how homelessness affects, a particular group or what challenges the homeless face. Then you wouldn't want it to be random because not everyone's homeless. And so if you try to interview someone about like what are the plight that the homeless face, but they're not homeless, they're not going to be able to give you the information that you need. So that's kind of why in qualitative research you only use sampling that's non-probability sampling. All right, participant observation. Just that the goal of it is to understand the social reality of a particular space or social location or whatever it is from an insider's point of view. So that you don't just observe the people from the outside, but you actually become a participant. So you have to enact some of the roles or, expected responsibilities or actions of people in that setting. All right, in a focus group, pretty straightforward. That question is it's a group interview. That's basically what it is. You put a bunch of people in a room, and then the researcher acts as a sort of moderator and asks a question, and it kind of facilitates a conversation among the entire group. All right, so this is your midterm review. Hopefully it's helpful. If you refine your studying to just these topics, you're going to do very well.